Hey guys, welcome back. You caught me. I'm finishing up this little demo here so that we can move on to our lesson for today. So today we'll be looking at how to add watercolors to an ink drawing, just to do some accent colors. We're going to be looking at some very basic techniques. Later on, when I do a different series, I'm going to focus in on just watercolors, but for this one, we're just going to look at three very basic techniques that you can use to add colors to an ink drawing. So I'm going to finish up what I'm doing here and then I'll be back. Alright, so before we get started, I just want to make sure that we have the stuff that we need. So say hi to Frank, he's holding the mic for us today. So first thing you want to make sure of is that you have thick enough paper. So you can use mixed media paper, or you can use watercolor paper, or any paper that is designed to get wet. Please don't use copier paper, it'll fall apart on you. You need watercolors, of course, so you can get them in cake forms like these right here, or you can get them in tube forms, which is my preference, or you can get them in colored pencils like this. Just make sure that they are watercolor pencils. You're going to need watercolor brushes. This is an example of my set, but you don't need this many. A medium one, a flat one, and a round one usually should be enough for the illustrations that we're going to be doing in class. And of course, you need some sort of mixing palette to mix your colors. Okay? And paper towels. Definitely want to have some paper towels. I also use a hair dryer. This is not required, but when you're trying to do things quickly, sometimes you need to dry things. If you're not in a rush, then you don't need it. You can just let it air dry. Alright, let me move all this stuff out the way and then we'll get started. This is what I was working on when you guys came in. So I have two trees, and this one I did the stippling technique on to put in my shadows, and this one I did nothing on. And the reason that we're doing this is because I want you guys to see the difference between using watercolors in combination with ink and what it looks like without the ink. And remember that this is just one of the inking techniques, so you can do this with any of the techniques that we've covered so far. But before we start adding watercolors, I'm going to go over a few things. I'm going to be using a very limited palette here. So what I have is phthalo blue and yellow, and then some burnt sienna, which is a light brown, ultramarine blue, and some alizarin crimson. And then we're going to mix new colors with those. The first one is called wet on dry, and it's the most common one that everyone pretty much knows. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to grab some clean water, put it over here, and then I'm going to take whichever color I want to work with and I'm going to bring it into the water. Watercolors are designed to be see-through, so you do not want to put this on really thick. If you're going to mix colors, make sure that you clean your brushes in between. So like if I wanted to mix a nice little green, I do the yellow, then I clean my brush, and then I grab a little bit of the green, or excuse me, of the phthalo blue, mix them together. Clean your brush. So, wet on dry. All that simply means is that you take your brush, your paint, and you paint onto a you want to paint onto a dry surface. That's it. The advantage of working with wet on dry is that the paint's going to stay wherever you put it, and you're going to get these nice clean lines right here. The disadvantage is that if you're trying to blend colors, the paper is going to absorb the ink too fast, or excuse me, the watercolors too fast, and it's not going to give you time to blend. Okay? But when you're doing detail work and you need things to stay put, you need the colors to stay put, this is a really good technique. Okay, very simple to do. The second technique that you need to know is called wet on wet, or wet into wet. Okay? And all you're doing there is you're going to wet the surface first. So let's say that I want to create a little area right here. I'm going to take some clean water and I am going to wet the surface, the area that I want to work on. Now, I know it's hard to see in the camera, so if I lift it up, you can see where it's shiny That tells me that the paper is wet. And then you take your colors and you paint on the wet surface. Now, because this area is wet, it gives you a lot more time to blend. Okay? So that's one of the big advantages. So for example, if I wanted to make this lower part a little bit darker, I can take a little bit more of that same color and add it in there. Because the paper is wet, I didn't have to rush. So right here, there's a really nice blend that you can do while the paper is wet, while that little area is wet. You can also use this technique when you want to blend multiple colors. So let's say that you want to create a green, but you don't want to do it on the palette. Maybe you want to mix it on the canvas or on the paper. So again, I'm going to wet the area. And typically, I like to start with the lighter color, in this case, the yellow. And I'm going to go ahead and put it on here. And again, because the paper is wet, I don't have to rush. Now I'm going to pick up some of the phthalo blue, which is here, and start putting this down here. Now you'll notice that the watercolors only move where the water is, right? See how it stays right there? That's because I didn't wet that area. So that's a nice advantage that you can take off. Now, if I want to make that green that we were talking about, I can take some of this blue, push it up, and it creates that green. So you have yellow, green, blue. And all I'm doing right now is just smoothing this lower part out. So what I did, I cleaned my brush, dried it a little, and then just hit it. And that's it. So wet on wet, whenever you want a nice soft blend, or if you want a soft blend mixing colors, works really well. Okay. And then the last technique that you need to know is the layering. Before we do layering though, I have to dry all of this stuff, because if I try to do layering while this is wet, it won't work. It'll bleed into each other and it'll create a mess. So let me take a few minutes, dry this with the hairdryer, and then I'll be back. A third technique that you want to know is called layering. And the important thing about layering is that if you're going to layer, the first layer that you've done, regardless of whether it's flat, graded, or colored, they have to be absolutely dry. Otherwise, when you try to do this next step, it'll get all messed up. So I've already taken the time to dry all this, and now I'm just going to go ahead and do a layer. So let's say, for example, that I want to create something dark in front of this right here, and I don't want that to move. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab a little bit of the brown, mix it over here. Remember, always mix your colors with water. Never take it directly from here and put it on here. And I'm going to go a little bit darker, so I'm going to add a little bit of the ultramarine blue to that brown. And it's going to create like a grayish color. Okay. I'm going to go a little darker. Okay. Okay. So I'm ready. So now I can just take my color, make sure my hand's out of the way, and go right over that layer that I did before. Now you can see that that color is not dark enough, so it's not really showing up that great. But what it does let you see is that because the layer underneath is completely dry, that line, those edges, stayed nice and crisp. If I would have done this while that surface was still wet, it would have made a mess, and you would not have the same control. So I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm just going to go a little darker so that you guys can see it. Alright, that's darker. Okay, So let's say that I'm doing something like this, and I can just paint right over that. And you can see, because watercolors are see-through, you can still get a sense of the color that's underneath, but those edges stay nice and sharp. Okay, that's super important that you make sure that the layer underneath is completely dry. Let me show you what happens if you forget to do that. So let's say that I have a layer here that I really liked. So that's just phthalo blue there. And let's say that you're like, oh, I want to put in a layer and I want it to be green, or I want it to be yellow, or I want it to be red, and you try to do it while that's wet. So let's see what happens. So you can see that edge is not nearly as crisp as this one here, and because this area is wet, it's going to keep blending. So it could get really ugly by the time this paper dries. So whenever you want to create a nice crisp line and you want to do it as a layer, make sure that you completely dry the layer underneath first. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you a little bit of how this painting, and this is just a demo, so it's not an actual painting, it's just some exercises. But I want you to see how these techniques are used and how different they look from each other, because this one already has ink on it and this one does not. So you're going to get different effects. So the first one I'm going to do is the wet into wet, and I'm going to work on the background. Okay. So I've switched over. I got a slightly bigger brush, and that's really because I want to wet this area quickly. But again, if you don't have one, it's okay. When you're doing this area, when you're wetting this area right here, it doesn't have to be all pretty. All you want to do is just kind of get it wet to give you that extra time that you're going to need when you start adding the colors. And remember, the paper is going to start to dry fairly quickly, so once you get that area wet, you want to start painting on it fairly quick. And I want to keep this soft, so I'm actually going to go with the ultramarine blue. Excuse me, I'm going to go with the phthalo blue, and I'm mixing it up with water. That's nice and wet, so now I can just start putting in my colors. Because the paper is wet, I get that nice extra time to blend. I'm going to leave little pockets of white to indicate some clouds. Then when I get near the tree, I'm just going to kind of be a little bit careful. Notice how those edges are starting to get nice and fuzzy because the paper is wet. And I don't have to worry about it's just going to dry up on me before I'm done. As long as I work relatively quickly while the paper is wet, I should be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this guy and then dry it with my hair dryer, and then I'll be back. Now that the sky is all done and dried completely, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the two trees. I'm going to do them with the same color so that you can see the difference. And I'm going to go with like a bluish green. So one little thing here, you'll notice that these colors are starting to dry up. Well, watercolors are not considered permanent, so all you have to do to reactivate these is just add a little water to it. The other thing is, whenever you're mixing a color, always start with the lighter color and then gradually build up your shadows. So since I want to make a blue-green, I'm going to start with the yellow and then start adding the blue a little bit at a time. If you do it the other way around, you're going to find it difficult to make the color lighter. Once the color gets dark, it's much more difficult to make it light again. So I'm going to start off with a generous amount of yellow. Clean my brush. Grab some of this blue and start mixing it together. And I'm using the phthalo blue again. The ultramarine blue works better when you're making purples. And to me, that's not blue enough. So, clean my brush, grab some more of the blue, mix it together. There we go. Since this is an evergreen, a lot of the evergreens have a kind of like a bluish hint to them. That's why I don't want to make it a bright green. So I've mixed up enough color, hopefully, to do both of the brushes. So for this technique, I'm just going to go wet on dry. So I'm not going to pre-wet the paper. So you'll see how easily this goes on. Turns out I had to stop for a couple of minutes and this dried up. Not a problem, because watercolors are not permanent. You simply grab a little bit of water, rehydrate it, and you are good to go. Both of these are painted with pretty close to the same color, and you can see a big difference. Because this one we already did the inking on, you can clearly see the separation of the branches. But here, it looks very flat. You can still see a little bit of the pencil lines, but there's no real definition here. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch techniques, and we're going to go into wet on dry, and we're going to layer. So we're going to mix up a slightly darker value, and then we're going to put in the shadows on here to separate these branches from each other. Now I'm going to dull it a little bit, so I'm just going to reach in over here, grab a tiny bit of the red, crimson, and add it to this, just to make it a little bit darker. And the reason that I did crimson is because red is the opposite of green, and you can use that to dull the colors like I did here. A little test. Okay, that should be dark enough. Alright, so what I want to do is I want to layer so I can still see my pencil lines, and that's going to help me create a separation. So the light source is still coming from here, so I know that these shadows are going to be predominantly on the right side. Now another way that you can do this is you can shade in the direction opposite of the light. So since the light's on this side, then I want to pull my shadows opposite. So I'm just going to go at an angle. Now because the paper is dry, you can see that wherever I put the brush stroke, that's where it's going to stay. So it really becomes a choice. And I often get asked that. It's like, which one is right? The one that's right is the one that better suits the technique that you're trying to get, or the effect that you're trying to get. So if you want it super smooth, then this one would be more correct. But if you want to show a little bit of texture, then the one that I'm doing right now would be a little bit more correct. It's a matter of choice, right? Because the purpose of this channel is not to tell you this is the only way of doing it. It's to show you different techniques, and then you decide which techniques will work best for the effects that you're trying to get. So you can see these layering techniques works just fine as long as the layer that you're putting on top is slightly darker than the layer underneath. If you try to do it in the reverse order, because watercolors are see-through, the lighter colors won't show up. So I always suggest that you do the lighter color first, and then go back with the slightly darker color. So two very, very different effects. Now, obviously we got to do the ground, so we're going to do that next. All right, so back to wet into wet. So I'm going to wet this area right here. I'm going to put on my color, and then I'm going to dry it, and then I'm going to go in and do a layer of this to create the shadow underneath the tree. Here we don't have to worry about it because the shadow is already done with the ink. So now that this has been done and dried, the only thing left to do on this one is to put in a cast shadow. Light source is still over here, so we're just going to have the shadow going in this direction. And that's it. So to recap, for the sky, we did wet on wet. So we wet the entire sky. Then we started adding our colors, leaving areas of white to represent clouds. For the one on the left, we had already done the inking, the stippling effect with the ink, which is permanent. And then all we did was add colors on top of it. And then for the tree on the right, we did layering. So we did our first color, then we dried it thoroughly, and then we added our second colors where we wanted the shadows to be. So, which one is correct? It's not a matter of what's correct and what's not. So what you have to ask yourself is, which technique do you like better? So do you like this technique better, or do you like this technique better? And whichever one you prefer, that's the one that you want to include in your artwork. So here are two examples of watercolor paintings. The one on the left I did with inks and watercolors. The one on the right is just pure watercolors. Which one do you like best? Let me know what you think in the comments below. And thanks for watching.